Hello, I'm Nigel Kobold, and this is the Ranger, a pure ranged character with a focus on bows, throwing daggers, and a very small touch of faith casting for buffs and utility. This is another one of those builds that feels quite satisfying because they change up the usual playstyle just enough to make some sections of the games and certain boss encounters feel quite fresh again. I also like that this feels like kind of an understandable character to be in the lands between. They seem the type who could survive and thrive there. My headcanon for this is that maybe we've also come from the Badlands. Perhaps Horalu was once their chieftain, and while we didn't have his overwhelming strength, we had our cunning, and for that, we were granted a vision of grace. Outside of the RP, we get access to incredibly long-range attacks, high burst damage, a variety of elemental damage types, and easy access to both bleed and poison effects. Out in the world is a very enjoyable experience, picking off enemies from the distance with our bows and shredding them when they're in close to medium range with throwing knives. During boss encounters, if you are so inclined, and I will say I do recommend this with this build, getting a summon out to help you make space and then unload a bunch of heavy hitting weapon arts, really satisfying. If you're going in solo, you'll probably be relying a little more on quick running, rolling jump shots while waiting for opportunities for weapon arts. I will have links to the wiki for any of the items, spells, and abilities I use in the description below, so let's get into it. Our first weapon are the Smith's Script Daggers. You'll need 5 strength alongside an 11 in dexterity, intelligence, and faith. We are going to be setting these to quality, at which point they'll have a B scaling in strength and dexterity. These are a ton of fun. It's fair to call these a short-ranged weapon. You'll need to spend a little bit of time playing with them to get a feel for the range, but with the talisman we're running, you won't suffer much, if any, fall-off damage, which is quite nice. The jumping heavy attacks are really nice because you can jump backwards while throwing these and often either take out or seriously chunk most standard enemies before they even reach you. For bigger enemies, we will often rely on our weapon art Scattershot Throw, and you might be thinking, really? Without bleed or a status effect of some kind? And yeah, it's pretty good. It does solid damage up close, and it tends to flinch enemies, which, strangely enough, the version on the Claws of Night does not seem to do. It also has better range than the Claws of Night on the non-Ash War throws as well. But the Scattershot Throw is quite nice at hitting big enemies for decent damage, and it can also handle groups really well too. They're definitely not some busted OP clickbait weapon, but they're a lot of fun to use and still very solid in the damage department, particularly when you consider we're really mostly using these out in the world rather than on bosses. So, what are we using on bosses? Well, we're going to have 2 bows so that we can have access to 2 different Ashes of War. However, our main bow is Ansbach's bow, which is a long bow that functions as a short bow for quick running, rolling, and jumping attacks. It's got great damage as far as bows go and scales with a D in strength and dexterity, despite requiring only a measly 9 strength and then a whopping 43 dexterity to wield. It is going to be our default go-to all-purpose bow, and on top of all that, its fan shot Ash of War is incredible. It shoots out 8 arrows in a horizontal arc, which deals very high damage, even if only a very small fraction of the arrows land. This will eat through your arrows very quickly. You are only going to get 13 shots per stack of arrows. It does let you shoot as long as you have 1 arrow left, so you'll use 8 for 12 times and then 3 on the last one, theoretically. As a result, you do want to feel pretty confident that it will connect when you use it, but due to the wide arc, it is fairly easy to hit. This is definitely your burst skill, and you can definitely pump this into bosses to shred their health, particularly with bleed arrows. Our other bow is the black bow, functionally the same as Ansbach, where it's a longbow with a short bow, quick shots. It does a little less damage, has lower stat requirements at 9 strength and 20 dexterity, similar scaling. We have this because sometimes it is nice having the Barrage Ashtavor instead. I find I mostly use this if I know I'm going to be able to stand still and really let loose for a while, particularly status arrows, and out in the open world, I sometimes find this Ashtavor a little bit more valuable for tougher enemies than Fan Shot. We also take the Clawmark Seal for a little bit of buffing, and we have a bit of strength. May as well use it if you wanted to toss a damage spell in there, though definitely not a caster focused build. All that being said, if you like the idea of where this is going, but would like a proper melee weapon, or a shield for that matter, we have a very decent amount of our equipment load unused. Without unequipping anything, you can add a little over 20 weight to this and still medium roll, so you could easily get away with like a great sword and a medium shield. I think if you're looking on the lighter end, you could probably even get something like the Zweihander in here and have a colossal sword without messing up your weight too much. Getting into our armor, it is definitely here for fashion. I'll say up front, we do not achieve 51 poise, but if you would like to, you can swap out our gloves for the Gauntlets of Solitude and equip the Bullgoat's Talisman to hit 51 on the dot. Otherwise, we have a true mishmash of armor sets here. We are combining the Black Hood, Shadow Militiaman Armor, Iron Rivet Gauntlets, and the Mesmer Soldier Greaves. This outfit gives us a nice combination of blacks, browns, and greens, kind of to blend into nature. It also has heavier armor on the forearms and shins, while still leaving the feet in quiet leathers and our fingers free for deft precision. That said, I know nothing about archery. It might actually be very foolish not to have gloves on for shooting a bow, but this tarnish is from the Badlands, so yeah. On a more video gaming note, if you did want to wear the Black Knife chest piece for the Quiet Footsteps effect, it does mechanically fit with this character really well, but the look is just not the vibe I wanted for this. Moving on to Talismans, we have 3 pretty well locked in and 1 you can swap out. We are taking the Arrow's Soaring Sting for 8% increased arrow damage and increased range, while also helping the damage fall off on our daggers as well. Arrow's Sting for another 10% increased arrow damage. Shard of Alexander for 15% increased attack power on our Ash of War abilities. I'll talk about the arrows in a little bit more detail later, but our go-to arrow is going to be the basic crafted Bloodbone arrow. As a result, I tend to take Lord of Blood's Exaltation for the 20% increase to damage for 20 seconds after we proc bleed. This definitely does work best if you're going the summoning route, so you can drop attention on yourself for a little bit, get off some good shots in the Ashes of War and proc that. If you are not going to be able to make use of bleed, a defensive or utility talisman is a great pick here, Dragon Crest Great Shield probably being my go-to. For our stats, we are going to be going 50 Vigor, 21 Mind, 30 Endurance, 40 Strength, 43 Dexterity, 11 Intelligence, 25 Faith, and minimum Arcane, 9 for me. If you are taking your character above this point, more Strength and Dexterity definitely are going to help your damage, but you have a lot of freedom on how you want to take it. I personally might start putting more points into Faith, so spells become a bit of a better option, but it's up to you. Depending on your starting class, you might need to drop a few points, and I'd probably say Strength is the easiest place to do that without losing too much. Moving on to Consumables, let's get a couple out of the way that aren't arrows. For our body buff slot, I do like having the option of Boiled Crab for the 20% physical damage negation. A risky option that I don't tend to use, but I'll mention for those of you who are actually good at dodging, is the Blood Boil Aromatic for 30% increased physical damage, 20% max stamina, and then of course 25% more damage taken. If you're good at dodging, it lasts 60 seconds rather than Flame Grammy Strength 30. Alright, arrow time. I am not going to talk about every arrow, but I am going to post this graphic from Fexture Life with the merchants that have unlimited stock arrows. I'll post a link to that in the description as well. When possible, try to use ones that are going to counter damage resistances. But that said, our go-to is the Bloodbone arrow. This is a craftable arrow, however, it only requires thin beast bones and blood roses to craft, both of which are purchasable indefinitely. You can get the bones from the Bone Peddler's Ball Bearing from the Bell Bearing Hunter that invades at the War Master Shack. This only happens at night, so I found the best way to get him to spawn is to rest there, pass time to night, then quit and re-enter the game. The blood roses can be purchased from the merchant in Mogwin's Palace, or you can just kill the merchant and get it from the Twin Maiden Husks at Round Table. The beauty of the Bloodbone arrows, though, is you can stock up on the materials and just craft more out in the world, which means you can replenish your arrows to max without resting. Say you've gotten to a boss fight or a tough enemy, this goes a really long way in extending how long you can use your bow. Beyond that, blood loss is just such a strong effect. These are probably the arrows you would want to use anyway. For our physic, we have some options. I almost always take the blood-sucking crack tier, as we can offset its damage over time somewhat via regeneration spell, and 20% increased damage for 3 minutes is pretty huge. Our secondary option can change a bit. If you're going to use summons and know you'll have an opportunity to just unload on a boss, the Viridian Hidden tier is incredible. No stamina consumption for 15 seconds means you can just go into your Ash of War stance and let loose with either Barrage or Fan Shot and do some really incredible damage. If not, some good general purpose options are the Green Burst Crystal tier for some additional stamina recovery, or the Opaline Hard tier for 15% damage negation. This does stack with the Boiled Crab, so I find sometimes if I'm having trouble just getting blown up, you can put those on, maybe switch to Dragon Crest Talisman, and you'll really boost your survival quite a bit. For your Great Rune, I'd probably go with Godric's. You get value from a lot of different stats, but none of them are really, you need to use it, so you can pick your favorite if you have another preference. For spells, we are going to take Golden Vow for 15% increased damage and 10% damage negation for 80 seconds, Blessing's Boon for 8 HP regeneration per second for 90 seconds, Flame Grant Me Strength for 20% physical and fire damage and 5 stamina regen per second for 30 seconds, and Flame Cleanse Me to get rid of Rotten Poison. Outside of these buffs, I don't have any must-have spells. For myself, I wanted to keep this character closer to, low magic, since you've got answers for range, single target, decent area of effect, all from your weapons. That said, if you were looking for some general recommendations, you are using the Clawmark Seal, so the bestial incantations would feel fitting. Aside from that, some that I think I probably would take would be Darkness, Shadow Lure, and Poison Mist. They all have a very appropriate vibe if you don't mind throwing some more active magic use onto the character. And that's the build. I got this one rolling going into another New Game Plus cycle, and it has been a blast. It's easy in Elden Ring or the Souls games to get hyper fixated on just crushing bosses, but particularly in Elden Ring, so much of the game is out in the world, and this build feels just exceptionally satisfying. Bows and ranged weapons always felt great in the open world, so really leaning on them hard has made going through the main game Legacy dungeons a ton of fun. And of course, the boss actually handles bosses quite nicely too, particularly going the summon route, admittedly. If you enjoyed the build, it'd be rad if you left it a like, maybe even a comment. Let me know if there's a certain build or a vibe you'd like to see me take a crack at in the future. If you want to see more, subscribing probably won't make you lose any sleep, and I'd be pretty stoked about it. Regardless, thanks for watching. Good luck.